Welcome back to the 25th Annual Stegner Symposium. My name is Robin Craig. I'm the James I. Farr Presidential Professor of Law here at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law and a professor in the Stegner Symposium and Environmental Law program. I am here to welcome our panel on what the future holds for our agricultural producers from a variety of perspectives. I am lucky to be joined by a number of panelists who bring their own unique geographic and professional perspectives to these questions, and it should be a very interesting moderated discussion. So to introduce our panelists, first we have Xiaoxue Du, who goes by Rita, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology at the University of Idaho. She has a master's in applied economics from the University of Idaho and a PhD from UC Berkeley in agricultural and resource economics. She researches on risk management and international trade. Our second panelist is Janaki Jagannath, who is currently a student in law school at UC Davis. However, before going to law school, she directed the Community Alliance for Agroecology, which is a coalition of rural community-based organizations in the San Joaquin Valley of California, looking to advance agriculture and environmental policy towards justice for the communities that are bearing the burden of California's food system. Third, we have Jillian Hishaw, who is the founding director of Family Agricultural Resource Management Services, or F.A.R.M.S. She is an agricultural attorney and author of Don't Bet the Farm on Medicaid. Her organization, F.A.R.M.S, provides technical and legal assistance to small-scale farmers and helps to reduce hunger and food insecurity in the communities that it serves. And then last but not least, joining us by audio is Richard Knight, who is a professor emeritus of wildlife conservation at Colorado State University. He is also the vice president of conservation of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and works in the areas of land use and land health in the West. So a very diverse assemblage of panelists, and I will be asking each of them a question, give them each an opportunity to answer, and then we will move on to the next question. So panelists, Rita, starting with you, what do each of you see as the most important environmental issue or challenge for farmers and ranchers in your area over the next 40 to 50 years? Rita, what can you tell us from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Robin, for the question. And, you know, I was a master's student in Idaho for 10 years ago, and I came back as a faculty at the University of Idaho. So I relatively know better about Idaho than other states. So what I see is that in the future, it could be an issue for climate change in Idaho area, because I do see that because of the global warming, we do have more wildfires in recent years. And also, I think it will be a big challenge for our water resource management in the future, because Idaho is a very big state of water user for agriculture. And the water is very important for farmers and ranchers for sure. And how to manage our water resource is a big challenge, because, for example, we have a few reservoirs on Boise River, and to operate the reservoirs, it requires like two objectives, but it could be conflicting. So we want to make sure to minimize the flooding risk, and it requires us to lower the water level in the reservoir. But at the meantime, we want to make sure our farmers will have enough water for irrigation in the summer, for example. So due to the global warming, and let's say we are under a lot of uncertainties of, do we have more frequent extreme weather events or not in the future? We don't know yet. It's like, are we going to have a higher flood risk, or because of the global warming, it could reduce the snowpack, which is the major storage of water for agriculture. And how do we manage our reservoir smart enough, or let's say climate smart, is a big challenge for us. And I think that is the most biggest challenge I see for the future in Idaho.
Okay, thank you. Janaki, wildfires, water management, sounds like maybe California shares some of these same issues. What would you say is the biggest environmental issue or challenge for farmers in California?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Robin. I probably won't be the only person on this panel to also say that climate change, kind of as this large ecological crisis, is something that encompasses not only an environmental concern, but kind of where the touch points of the future of human communities in the midst of climate change are kind of most elevated, are kind of where farm workers live, and those being the communities that I have historically worked in. So I'm talking predominantly about the large swath of agricultural land in the middle of California called the San Joaquin Valley that produces the majority of our cash crops, and California being a leading agricultural producer, both in terms of production, diversity of production, but also farm gate incomes. You know, we're talking about the impacts of climate change on the capacity to produce, but also on the human communities that are nested within this large agricultural region, who continue to lack access to safe and affordable drinking water, who continue to deal with some of the impacts of increasingly fatal summers, truly, as the temperatures rise, and also people who deal already with a disproportionate amount of local pollution in their area from polluted groundwater, as I was saying, exposure to pesticides and fertilizers, and fumigants, and kind of the incidence of that burden is something that continues to threaten the ability for those communities to thrive, have access to to have a diversity of economic opportunities, and for those communities to be safe places to live for our farm worker labor force in the coming years. So that's something that our state is looking at, and in terms of solutions, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that during the course of this panel, but there are kind of forward-looking ways to engage those local residents in crafting what those solutions look like, so that they are not just sort of top-down solutions that are maybe something that someone thought up in our capital, but don't actually have the ability to have an impact on people's lived realities. And I think that's something that California is piloting, is how to like engage farmers and farm workers in creating collaborative solutions around some of these things. So I'll leave it at that for now. Okay,
thank you. Jillian, you also work with communities trying to find various kinds of solutions in a variety of locations. So what would you identify as the biggest environmental challenge that they are facing?
Lack to access of climate resistant seed. I find that, especially in the Southeast, where most of my work has started, in the Midwest, which is where I'm from, in Kansas City, that water has always been plentiful. Right now we have too much water. The fields are too wet to plant. So I guess we kind of have the opposite of the states out west. But there, right now, the past 2 days, there's a seed shortage. A lot of the seed companies are running out of seed as I speak, because a lot of home gardeners are buying up seed because of the current situation. And many of my farmers that I work with can't afford to buy seed for the fall. And a lot of the spring and now the summer crops are now sold out on a lot of these seed websites. So I think that seeds are definitely the issue, as well as soil loss and erosion. I believe that we're losing too much soil in the process. Even with too much water, you also have soil loss, whether it's lost through, you know, the wind, or lost through you know, the sea and things of that nature through water distribution. But soil loss and access to seed, I find, is the biggest issue.
Okay, so very different issues than we are seeing in the West. Good.
Yes.
Rick, you work mostly with ranchers, not farmers per se. What would you say is the biggest environmental challenge that ranchers are facing?
Hi, Robin. I would say it's probably climate change. You know, the state of Colorado and much of the American West is defined by not enough water, and certainly a lot of the ranch operations in Colorado are extremely dependent upon the snowpack we have, and when that melts in June and heads down the rivers and then is distributed via irrigation ditches to their grass and hay fields. If they don't have enough water, they aren't going to be able to irrigate the grass and hay fields, and if they don't have adequate crops of winter forage, the livestock are going to be in a sort of an energetic stress point going into calving come springtime. So it's the arid West has worked out this way of ranching working as long as you have sufficient water to grow an adequate amount of forage to support the mother cows when they're not on spring or summer grass. And so I think a warming climate, we actually had a preview of this in Colorado in 2002. It was the driest year in over 200 years. And dry being defined by obviously not as much rainfall, but most importantly by a greatly reduced snowpack and greatly reduced June runoff. And ranchers in Colorado and other parts of the arid West were desperately trying to find sources of hay to go and purchase and truck in. And that adds a real serious economic burden on that thin economic margin that most ranchers operate on.
Okay, thank you. Well, as this discussion has already indicated, the environmental issues tend to slide fairly immediately into the social and the economic issues. So that will be my next question. And Janaki, I'll start with you. You mentioned that the communities in the San Joaquin Valley are being directly affected by climate change. How would you expand upon the most important social and economic issues and challenges that those farmers are facing?
Yeah, first of all, pardon me, there's some noise of there's some maintenance happening right outside the window right here. So there's some hammering happening, but to get into kind of some of the detailed experiences of what people experience in Central California, which is the region that we're referring to as the San Joaquin Valley. It's a bunch of contiguous counties that when folks hear about kind of the big agricultural industry of California, it is primarily concentrated in this area. And these are the counties which produce a lot of our perennial orchard crops, and it's also very importantly home to our enormous dairy industry. We're the leading dairy state in the United States. And when communities who have historically been the farm workers upholding this industry sort of created the communities that they currently live in, I mean, we've sort of seen a very dramatic transformation in agricultural industry in California. So I'm talking about kind of beginning in the 1920s and just preceding the 1920s, were during the Dust Bowl era. We had a period when there was a large influx of migrants who arrived in California, and essentially dovetailing with the rise of our perennial orchard crop economy and the creation of the railroad, small little towns popped up as the labor centers for what are kind of the large farms that were producing citrus and plums and peaches and grapes and all the things that were demanded by the East Coast at that time in the rest of the United States. And kind of over the course of history, those communities have remained relatively static. You know, I like to say that not a lot in terms of quality of life, access to education and upward mobility has changed for those pockets since The Grapes of Wrath was written. And those towns continue to be our modern day, what we call environmental justice communities, who, although our agricultural industry has transformed dramatically in terms of what we produce, how we produce it, how land is managed, those towns are still there, sort of providing labor, and the governments around those places traditionally have not kind of extended the appropriate services to those communities to ensure that they're able to enjoy the same benefits of our $40+ billion agricultural industry. And so in terms of climate change right now, I would say that this is a moment when California is kind of waking up to the needs of those towns, and everybody already on this panel has discussed the lack of access to water. And I think the water scarcity has really kind of, for better or for worse, created an aperture for the California legislature to realize, like, okay, here we have over 1 million people who during the peak of the drought go without access to clean drinking water, clean and affordable drinking water. And that intersects with climate change. And we need to pass robust policies to ensure that people are able to participate in water management. And furthermore, that what we call climate-friendly ag practice programs include set-asides for ensuring that the local farm worker communities enjoy some benefit of them. And this gets into some kind of a little bit more nuanced how our statutes are actually crafted in terms of tying our climate change program to a set of criteria that ensure accountability to what are called co-benefits, to ensure that these small pockets of historically disadvantaged farm workers enjoy some of those benefits. But it is a strategy right now that I'd be happy to go into it a little bit further if there's time, to ensure that as farmers in California apply for things like irrigation enhancement, so shifting from flood irrigation to drip irrigation that's subsidized by the state, when they apply for the Healthy Soils Program, which is soil carbon sequestration and soil improvement program, when they apply for alternative manure management money, which is to shift from essentially holding manure in a lagoon to doing different practices like dry scrape or composting their manure. All of those programs include in them kind of criteria to ensure that that farmers who apply with some foresight to ensuring environmental justice and environmental sustainability for those local communities, those applications receive a little bit higher score. So that's something that's really cool that California is doing, and all of that ties back to our larger cap and trade program. So it's a model for, I would say, for other states to look at too.
So it sounds like California has done a fair amount of work to try and integrate all of these various facets.
Yes, so and it hasn't been easy. Of course, it takes a lot of grassroots power and, you know, advocating at the state capitol by a lot of robust nonprofit organizations who work directly with farm workers.
Great, great. Well, Jillian, let's turn to you. In the Southeast and the Midwest, what do you see as the biggest social and/or economic challenge facing farmers there?
Well, I guess it's two different groups. So I primarily work with farmers of color, African American, Native farmers, things like that. And particularly in the African American community, we lose 30,000 acres in land ownership per year. And it's due to many reasons. One of the number one reasons that I find is lack of estate planning. And so having more access to legal services, particularly estate planning services, is definitely needed. About 72 to 73% of African Americans in this country die without a will, and 60% of Hispanics die without a will in the United States. And so socially, we definitely need more legal services with the overall demographic of the population of farmers being an aging population. And I feel as though that there's not enough estate planning and elder care services for just small farmers rather in general. And I think that that's needed. Also, access to equitable, fair lending. The USDA is notorious, as I'm sure we all know, with unfair lending practices, particularly to farmers of color, which spun all of the class action suits with Pickford and Keith Siegel and Garcia and Love for the Women. And so that is continuing. I have cases where one of the husband's signature has been forged on a farm loan without consent. And because of that, the farm was foreclosed on. And so these types of discriminatory practices with USDA and lending is also something. Recently, the past 2 years, I've been finding that those same traditional lending discriminatory practices are now being implemented for small farmers that are white. And so it also goes to the question of economic justice. I just feel as though the USDA is squeezing the small farmer out purposefully. And just look at what's going on right now. Right now, we're no more than ever dependent on our small farmer. I have small farms that are calling me before I got on this webinar saying, hey, we got business again, but we don't have the money to buy seed. So, I mean, it's kind of an ironic situation here, but we have to depend on our small farmers. And, the problem is that these corporate farms, they occupy 30% of, ag revenue. And that's a problem. And the lack of enforcement of GIPSA and anti-force is forcing, all of these farmers out of business. I mean, between 2007 and 2017, over 140,000 farms went out of business or consolidated. And it's purposeful because of how USDA policy is structured.
Okay, well, for the benefit of our readers that don't know GIPSA, can you explain a little bit more about the failure to enforce that?
Sure. So GIPSA is the Grains Packard and Stockyards Act. Is basically the antitrust of the ag sector. And it's created to create a fair market. And unfortunately, there is no fair market in this country when 50% of all meat, beef, pork, and poultry are owned by 4 different integrators. And then 83% of the world's seed is owned by 2 corporations. That's a problem. and they control all of the seed, all of the fertilizer, and it's just ridiculous. The DOJ and FTC is rubber stamping all of these mergers. And, you know, it has to get approved by the EU, but there needs to be some type of global, I don't know, pushback against all of this antitrust. And some of these corporations need to be broken up. And this is why we're having all of these, you know, consolidated farms.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Rick, what would you say is the biggest social and or economic issue facing ranchers?
Well, probably the most serious social issue right now facing ranchers is this, again, lack of planning the family estate. Just the inability to work on the economics and the family dynamics, so the ranch is transitioned from parents to children. In terms of the economic issues, I actually see two. One, I think all economists are comfortable with the term the highest and best use. And in the arid West, there is a highest and best use of ranch lands and ranch water that ranch economics simply can't successfully compete with, and that is what we call ex-urban development, buying of the ranches and subdividing them into small acreage parcels 20 miles, 30 miles from town, and then also buying the water. In Colorado, every time a new housing development is planned and a permit is applied for, they have to have a 100-year supply of water. And water has been commodified in Colorado, as some people are aware of, and so you can simply buy and sell shares of water on an open market. So you go out there and you buy shares of water from ranchers, and it's commonly called buy and dry, where you buy the ranch, you buy the farmland, you take the water and you break up the land and put homes on it. The second economic I guess challenge right now is, and I think we're all aware of this, farmers and ranchers, and I focus on ranch lands, but ranchers actually hold two different goods, a private good and a public good. And of course, the private good is what they're actually reimbursed for. So in the case of a rancher, it's sheep, it's goats, or it's cattle. But the public good, or the public good, are these ecosystem services that come off these undeveloped rangelands that benefit all members of society. So their contributions of these undeveloped lands and holding on to carbon in the soil and the roots of the plants, and providing wildlife habitat and helping purify water, just a variety of things, and producing food. Another one. So they've got all these ecosystem services, and we talk about payments for ecosystem services, but what we lack in Colorado and across much of the West are marketplaces where the rancher can be actually compensated for the economic value of those ecosystem services. Just as an example, last year the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust completed 17 conservation easements, and the economic value of those conserved lands of the ecosystem services was just under $1 million, and that would be on an annual basis. Well, the landowners are holding on to those because they're giving up the rights in a conservation easement to ever develop their ranch lands. So those ecosystem services are going to be generated each year off of those conserved private ranch lands. But the landowner, of course, is only being compensated for the livestock that they are selling off the ranch lands. They're not being compensated for the ecosystem services that benefit all of us.
Thank you, Rick. Just as a quick follow-up, would you like to see a system where the value of those ecosystem services could be part of the calculation of highest and best use?
So
Just
It's an amazing question, Robin. We actually passed a bill in the Colorado Assembly last year, the Colorado Cattlemen's, where we have an alternative valuation process, and we're working with the Ag Econ Department at Colorado State and Fort Collins to come up with an alternative valuation of these ranch lands based on the value of the ecosystem services. So we're in our second year of planning on this, and we hope to have a plan going forward and going back to the Assembly. And if we could actually do that, because the historic way of appraising ranch lands, of course, are based on their highest and best use, which is usually development. If we could find this alternative way of valuing ecosystem services, you'd all of a sudden start seeing these undeveloped rangelands have very high value. So yes, I would. And Colorado is hard at work at trying to come up with an alternative valuation system.
Oh, very, very interesting. Good to hear. All right.
So that was a great question.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done. Thank you.
All right. So Rita, circling to you, what do you see, and you are our economist, so what do you see as the biggest social or economic issue in the Idaho region or the Mountain West, however you want to focus it?
Yes, so like you said, as an economist point of view, I'm certainly care about demand and supply in the market. And in our Idaho region, our farmers, they are so good at produce their ag products. However, we cannot eat all of the products we produced, so we need to sell them to somewhere. And it's not only because I'm interested in international trade, but it is of the fact that trade in agricultural products is very important to our farmers and ranchers in Idaho, for example. And we do have like about 50% of the wheat we produce are selling to the foreign markets. And also we sell a lot of dairy products and of course Idaho potatoes to foreign markets. So I see that one thing of my concern for now is actually about international trade, or let's say the international relationship between US and the rest of the world. And because of the globalization, economists will say that it's overall a good thing for a country and we could get benefit from trade. However, it's not necessarily true that the globalization will benefit everyone within a country. So it means trade will create winners and losers, let's say for producers or consumers. And we probably want to look at how to balance the winner's gain and the loser's loss. So for example, for the US, we maintain an ag trade surplus for many, many years in the past. However, we also lose some manufacturing jobs. And for example, if you see a tag on your clothes or when you buy a cheap toys at Walmart, you may see it's not made in US, but instead it's made in China, made in Vietnam or Indonesia, etc. So it could be a challenge that how our leaders to handle the international relationship with the rest of the world, because, well, it's not new that we heard a lot of trade tension news from the last year. And also it could be possible that if the US say, okay, I don't want to buy any manufacturing goods from the rest of the world, it's possible that the rest of the world will say no to our agricultural products. So that could be a problem for the farmers and ranchers in the US. And especially in Idaho, we rely on the ag exports for our economy and farmers' income. So international relationship is one issue I can see for now. And another thing about the economic challenge in the future I want to mention is about the technology adoption in agriculture. So for example, right now, people are talking about big data. And there are some private firms that are using remote sensing technology to collect data and forecast the yield in the future. And actually there is a professor at the University of Georgia, and she did a research with her co-authors, and they are comparing the precision of a private firm's forecast with the USDA's forecast and see which one is better. But briefly speaking, their conclusion is that, okay, the private firm's forecast is not yet be more precise than the USDA one. But however, we can see that it's a trend to use the big data to do some analysis. And it's possible that in the future, a crop insurance company using the big data collected from farmers, and they probably will know much better than the farmers themselves. So, but is this a good thing or bad thing to farmers? We don't know yet. And a more complicated question is, who owns the data? Do farmers own the data, or do the private firms, they own the data? We don't know. It could be a challenge for policymakers, maybe. And another type of technology is about automation in agriculture. And for example, right now I'm working on a project studying the costs and impacts of using robotic milking systems. So robotic milking is still a hot topic right now. And also in Idaho, well, we are not only famous as Idaho potato, but we also have a lot of dairy farmers. And for those dairy farmers, it will be a question that should they use the robots to milk their cows? Because the robots is very expensive. So is it worth to do so? Well, there are some impacts of adopting robots. So for example, it could, well, there are some research articles show that using robots could increase your yield of milk. And also farmers will not, they don't have to get up early at 4 o'clock in the morning in the winter to milk their cows. So there could be some benefit from using robots, but also some other questions we want to know is, will using the robots will replace the labor or not? So it could be a impact on social communities, like are people going to lose their job because farmers using robots? But we don't know the exact answer yet. It's because we can see that using robots will replace the task of milking a cow, but it's not necessarily that a worker will lose their job, because it's possible that we can do a training program to the farmers and let them switch their job from milking a cow to some other type of job. For example, on the same dairy farm, it's possible that the milker will no longer have to milk their cow because they have robots now, but they could have another task. For example, is manure management. So, and also because of the robots will collect a lot of data from each cow, and you will know more about your cow health and a lot of other informations. But how do you read those data? And are you going to do data analysis in the future? Or are we going to do more machine maintaining work later. So those are something we don't know yet. Those are some uncertainties we probably will have by adopting robots. So that's one example of the uncertainty and the impacts from adopting new technology in agriculture. So those are two types of issues I see for now and the future. One is about our international trade in agriculture. Another one is technology use in agriculture.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. That was a lot of big things to think about. Just a quick follow-up with you. One of the things that happened this morning was that Australia basically announced it was closing, basically sealing off its country, a little bit of trade, but nobody else gets in. Do developments like that because of coronavirus worry you at the moment?
Well, yeah, given the coronavirus issue right now, it's like it's hard to selling or buying stuff from foreign markets or sell ourselves to foreign markets, and but I think it's still a short run issue, but in the future I think it's still be good potential to sell our ag products to foreign markets because there are demands. And let me give you an example, like for our wheat farmers in Idaho, we sell a lot of wheat, and also actually Australia is a big wheat producer as well. So if we look at the years ago when they had that drought in their country, they will lower their wheat production. So, well, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but speak of our wheat farmers, it's good for them because they have more opportunity to sell their wheat to the world markets. So there are always some positive and negative. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, that was a very wide-ranging set of issues to come up. Everything from worrying about estate planning to worrying about technology to worrying about world trade to worrying about lending policy in the United States. Lot of concerns to be thinking about for U.S. agriculture and ranching for the future. So I'm going to ask each of you if you could prioritize one or two changes you would make to law or policy to help what you consider to be the biggest risk or uncertainty or combination of environmental, social, and economic issues. What would those changes be? And Rick, I'm going to start off by putting you on the spot.
Wow. Well, so this will get me in trouble in certain circles in a hurry, but I think sooner or later we're going to have to transition away from feedlots, dare I say this, and I think it would have a variety of actually human health and environmental health benefits associated with this. Of course, we'd have to figure out what to do with the state of Iowa. No, that's just a joke about all the feed corn that we grow there. But yeah, so I think the consumers are actually leading the way on this. It's truly amazing year to year to go into grocery stores and see this increasing number of grass-finished. Of course, most beef is grass-fed, but it's not finished on grass. But to increasingly see the meat options that are actually grass-fed as well as grass-finished. And there's one other, this is slightly off topic, but 20 years ago, a small group of us across the American West created something called the Radical Center movement. And we didn't appreciate 20 years ago that America was going to grow increasingly polarized between the rural-urban red-blue tribes. But the whole theme of the Radical Center was to build bridges between rural and urban communities over food and open space. And I think probably America needs that more than it needs virtually anything right now, is to actually find what we have in common and hold on to it. And there's abundant evidence that urban people deeply value open spaces and are becoming increasingly concerned and aware about what they eat, and they want to get to know the people who are actually producing the food and build a connection, or even get more personally involved in the food system. So I do think food and open space could actually heal some of these deep divisions that currently threaten even the short-term health of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Jillian, your top 1 or 2 priorities for improving this very complicated nexus?
I think that I agree with Mr. Knight that we should move away from CAFOs and go towards a more localized food system. Under my nonprofit, I have a food bank program. And so all of the produce that I get from farmers, it's donated in the farmers' community. And a lot of rural communities that I go into lack infrastructure. I think that there needs to be more dollars and investment in rural communities, but I think that it needs to be distributed based on kind of the top down. So the majority of land in this country are owned by whites, but 58 million acres are owned by natives, but over 850 million acres are owned by whites. And so that's definitely a stark disparity. And then 4.6 represents African Americans, 2.9 Asian, and then 32 Hispanic. And so there, that's a problem. And as long as we continue to have discriminatory practices with fair lending and just overall land ownership, we won't get over the differences that we have. And although the demographics are turning brown and black by 2040, that to me, that really, that's fine and good. But even though that's going to be the case, they're still not owning, it's the ownership, and then the demographics don't look the same. And so there needs to be some type of reckoning in regards to fair lending, and also USDA. The whole USDA needs to, clean house there, starting on the county level with these FSA county committees. There needs to be a different type of voting of each member, and more diversity initiatives. And so when we can get people on a level playing field economically, and with more access to capital and better infrastructure, more support of rural electric cooperatives and hospitals, that's when we'll see a kind of a more cohesiveness between urban and rural communities, and also within the demographics in this country. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Rita, what are your top 2? If you were in charge of the world for a day, what would you do?
Well, to me, I think I'm still like to see the technology innovation in the future, and that is the thing I'm most interested in. Because when people saying, okay, agriculture will have impacts on our environment, and then how do we deal with those type of issue? And it's probably one way is to adopt a new technology. For example, in the past years, we already have the drip irrigation to increase our water efficiency. And also, like I mentioned, like robotic milking, well, it's a good thing for dairy farmers. And also in the future, what kind of technology we could use to increase our production efficiency or at the meantime, can we reduce the impact for the environment? Can we have a new chemical and use less pesticides? So some questions like that. And also, another thing I'm thinking is, as a university faculty, I really want to provide some more materials, or let's say the scientific knowledge, to the general public. Because I do feel like, well, when I talk with my students in a class, and I can see that nowadays with a lot of social media and all types of sources, sometimes there are unreliable sources exist. And we can see some videos tell you that, okay, our Earth is a flat, it's not a ball or something like that. So some fake news, anyways. So I'm thinking, when people make judgment for learning, when they're learning a new type of thing, let's say when they learn about what is climate change, what is GMO, are they good or bad? I'm hoping that people can make a judgment based on they get enough scientific knowledge. It's not based on their friends on Facebook told them it's good or bad, or some impact from political influence. So as a faculty, I don't want to see those type of things. I want my students to have enough knowledge to make their own judgment. So it's also what I'm thinking for the general public, that we, as a university, we probably want to do like webinars like what we do today, and other educational materials that the general public can learn more about the facts. So those are two things I think I will do in the future. One is keep studying on the impacts of new technology innovation, and also providing more materials for general public, and trying to build a better education.
All right, thank you. Janaki, you get the last word on the top two innovations. What would you do?
Thanks. I would want to kind of triangulate some stuff that Ms. Hishaw said and what Mr. Knight said related to kind of building this solidarity between rural and urban places, but specifically the piece related to access to land for communities who have been historically left out of decision-making around the way agriculture looks and functions in the United States. And that, I really agree that it's an insurmountable difference if there isn't like proactivity by federal and state governments to address those historic inequities. And I wanted to mention that here in California, we worked to pass the Farmer Equity Act, which helped define what we already have in federal language around what's called the socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher. And that was subsequent to some of the cases that Ms. Hishaw already spoke about. But here in California, we changed the California Food and Agriculture Code to also include a state definition. And within that, what we're able to do is put 25% of our technical assistance money for climate change funds towards those specific demographics of farmers, prioritize funding for translation for some of these climate change programs, work on, we have a farm equity executive position for the first time within our California Department of Food and Agriculture. And though this might be kind of appear to be a sort of a shallow change in terms of trying to reckon with this huge history of inequity that we have. It's an incremental step that could open the door, hopefully, to at least building institutional power for communities of color to have participation in the way ag policies are crafted. And I think that's really, without kind of addressing those things, we're seeing ourselves come up again and again with, we can innovate and technologize and think our way through it, as many of these crises as we can. But if we're not doing it together and, understanding that all of our success and ability to thrive is really bound up in liberation for everybody, we're not going to get very far going alone. And the other thing that I would say, on my short list of things to change would be comprehensive immigration reform. And of course, here in California, maybe we are thinking about this a whole lot because we have such a huge amount of our food system wrapped up in detention right now. The fact that we have a food system that relies on a huge number of undocumented people currently, who are people who harvest, prepare, cook, serve, deal with the waste from our food system. And if the current virus crisis is not enough of an indication, we're in a moment where the economic cross-border volatility, we're yet to see kind of what that's going to look like long term. And unless we have capacity for the hardworking people who are, most vulnerable, both economically and socially, to be able to access safety in the workplace, our food system has a lot ahead of it, and I guess I say that with a little bit of fear, because I think the current moment it's one to feel a little bit afraid about that. But my hope is that, if we're able to at least sort of pilot some kind of programs where it's not just simply a revolving door for a labor visa, but rather a comprehensive immigration reform, that's something that we need in this moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I have to say, I think one thing that this panel has collectively made clear is that the production of food in this country is linked to pretty much everything else. Technology innovation, discrimination policies, land access policies, immigration reform, trust in the states, and financial planning. All of it is relevant. It's not just climate change, and it's not just what the individual farmers are doing on their fields. You all have had wonderful insights, and so I want to end this discussion by giving each of you a chance to put together a final thought, the message you want to leave the viewers of this video with, and we've got enough time that you can each take up to about 5 minutes to do that if you're so inclined. So Janaki, you haven't gotten to be first yet. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess in hopes of not being trite in such a immense moment that we're in, I just hope that in the work that we continue to do together in this moment of social distancing, that we're able to continue to think ecologically. And as you've already mentioned, Robin, we're noticing how the food system impacts all kinds of different areas of law and policy, but really discussing environmental issues, I very much hope doesn't kind of fall by the wayside in terms of thinking into the next 10, 20, 50 years of food and ag policy, just because we're about to see a whole lot change in all of our lives and in the lives of the farmers and farm workers that we serve. And I think the most that we can do to kind of remember that we all walk on land, and land ultimately absorbs whatever kinds of economic and social crises we go through, wars and pandemics. it's our responsibility at the end of the day to do what we can to collectively maintain our responsibility to steward land. And in many moments, that's going to mean reckoning with histories of racism. And I think in a moment like this, it might be the last thing on everybody's mind, but it truly is kind of, it peels off the layers of kind of blindness, I think, to those historic inequities when we're all facing a huge amount of uncertainty and crisis. So I would just want to extend my virtual hand to everybody to think through that collectively, like what our next steps are in solidarity with one another to ensure a sustainable future for food production.
Okay, thank you very much. Rita, do you have a final message you'd like to leave the viewers of this video?
Well, I think I don't have a lot to say, but I want to say, so if we look at the population in the world nowadays, people have to eat. So in the long run, I'm not so worried about our egg producers, because they are feeding our people in the US and also people in the rest of the world. So eventually they will have their markets to sell their products. However, nowadays they face different types of pressures, like from markets and the economic side, and also a lot of policies or environmental issue related. But in general, I think I'm still optimistic for our egg farmers in the future. And also, if we're looking at the consumer side, will they change their taste of food? For example, from the real beef to Beyond Meat is still related to like their beliefs. It's like, are they want to save our environment, and are they going to purchase more protein because they have a higher income, and all those type of things also related to people's thoughts, and do they have a better informed world, and can they make their unbiased judgment from what they learn on the internet, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rick, do you have a final message?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. A few years back, Laura Pritchard and Jeff Lee and I did a book called Homeland, Ranching in a West That Works, and we called it Homeland, 2 words instead of Homeland, because we thought a secure homeland was one where rural people appreciated all the benefits that they get from urban areas, but that we have urban people that appreciate all the things that rural people do, for example, food production and tying down open space. And so I do think we've not fully appreciated the incredible power of food and open space that it's produced on to bring America back together again.
Wow, thank you. Jillian, I'll let you finish this off. What are your final thoughts?
I just would employ the public to support their local farmer, because it keeps them in business, and to also encourage young people to start growing their own food and getting more interested in agriculture. Because as we move on, you know, in the decades here, we're going to need more young people and young farmers to kind of toe the hoe here. And so we definitely need to encourage more young people to enter into ag careers, particularly farming.
Okay, thank you. Well, that concludes our panel on the environmental, social, and economic challenges of the producers, facing the producers of our food. I would again like to thank our panelists, Xiaoxue, Jillian Hishaw, Janaki, Jagannath, and Richard Knight for joining us today. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for participating in this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin and panelists.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you. This was wonderful, all of you. It's very thought-provoking. This is going to be a video I'm going to make my students watch. So thank you very much.